Tonight, we follow a man who crossed an ocean and walked into the most powerful room in Japan, and the room had no idea what to do with him. His name is Yasuke, and this is not a story about a warrior. Not exactly. This is a story about what happens when the world encounters something it has never seen before, and has to decide, very quickly and with very incomplete information, what that thing means and what to do with it. We will follow him from the docks of Sakai, where a crowd of thousands pressed so hard against the walls and the gates that men were crushed in the trying to see him, through the corridors of Azuchi Castle, where the most feared man in Japan looked at him and laughed, not with contempt, but with the specific delight of a person who has spent a lifetime refusing to be surprised, and has finally been surprised. Through the years at the center of Oda Nobunaga's court, where a man from a continent that most Japanese people of this period could not place on a map moved through the most dangerous political world in Asia, with the specific and unremarked solidity of someone who had decided, somewhere in the crossing, that the only thing worth doing was to be completely and honestly present for whatever came next. All the way to the night in Kyoto in 1582, when the world he had built himself into burned, and the question of what happened after became one of the most honest silences in Japanese history. My name is Henry, and this is Boring Japanese History. If these stories help you drift, if the sound of ancient voices and distant rooms quiets something in you at the end of a long day, consider subscribing. There are more of them coming. More rooms, and more roads, and more lives that the world remembers, even when the world is not entirely sure why it remembers them. And tonight, one of those lives is Yasuke. But for now, close your eyes. Let your shoulders find the floor. Let the docks of Sakai come to you, the salt and the cedar and the crowd noise, and the specific quality of light off Osaka Bay in the late afternoon, when the ships are coming in, and the city is doing what port cities do, which is to say, receiving the world, and trying to decide what to do with what the world sends. There is a man stepping off a ship in the harbour of Sakai in the year 1579, and the harbour is not ready for him, and the city is not ready for him. And in a few weeks, when word of him reaches the castle on the hill, the most powerful lord in Japan will summon him and examine him and reach out a hand and touch his skin to see if the darkness comes away. Because the Lord has seen many things in his long and violent life, and has grown skeptical of things that seem impossible, and wants to verify, personally and directly, that what he is seeing is real. It is real. His name is Yasuke. He is somewhere between 20 and 30 years old, and no one in Japan has ever seen anyone like him. And in 2 years, he will hold a title that no foreigner had ever held before, and that very few have been given since. And in 3 years, the world he inhabited will be ash, and the historical record, which had been paying close attention, will go quiet at exactly the moment the story needs it most. We are going to follow him as far as the record goes, and then we are going to sit with what the silence means, because the silence is also a kind of answer. Shh. we begin. But first, one thing to know about this man. He arrived in Japan as a servant. He left as something the Japanese language had to invent a new category for. We will find out what happened in between. The harbour at Sakai in the year 1579 is one of the busiest places in Japan, which is to say, it is one of the busiest places in the world. Because Sakai in this period is the kind of city that exists at the intersection of enough trade routes and enough political arrangements and enough accumulated merchant wealth that it has developed over the generations a specific and cosmopolitan quality that most Japanese cities of this period do not have. A quality of having seen enough of the world arriving by ship that the arrival of the world, in whatever form it takes, does not usually produce the kind of response that the arrival produces on this particular afternoon. The Portuguese vessel comes into the harbour with the specific and unhurried quality of a ship that has been at sea long enough that the sight of land has moved from relief to simply the next thing. The sailors moving through the docking procedures with the practiced efficiency of people for whom this port is one in a long sequence of ports, familiar enough that the specific steps of arrival can be executed without the conscious attention that unfamiliar things require. The Jesuit missionary Alessandro Valignano is on board, the Italian priest who has been travelling through Asia for years with the specific and driven quality of a man who believes that the work he is doing is the most important work in the world, and who organizes every hour of the days available to him around that belief. He is accompanied by an entourage that includes translators and assistants and the various people that a man of his position in this period travels with when the travelling is serious and the distances are large. And he is accompanied by Yasuke. The accounts do not tell us what Yasuke was thinking as the ship came into Sakai harbour. They do not tell us much about his interior life at any point in the story, which is one of the things that makes the story what it is, which is to say, a story told largely from the outside. A story in which the central figure is observed and described and wondered at, but never fully heard from, never given the space in the record that the people who were observing him gave themselves. What the accounts tell us is what was visible, what was external, what the people on the dock and in the streets and pressing against the gates of the port could see when the ship came in, and the man they had never seen anything like stepped off it onto the soil of Japan for the first time. What they saw stopped the harbour. Not immediately, not all at once, not in the dramatic and simultaneous way that significant arrivals in stories tend to happen, but in the specific and organic way that information moves through a crowd. One person seeing and telling the next, and the next telling the one after. The wave of reaction moving outward from the dock through the assembled people of Sakai, with the specific and unstoppable quality of information that is too extraordinary to be held by the person who received it, that demands to be shared before it can even be fully processed, that moves faster than comprehension because comprehension takes time and the need to tell does not wait for comprehension to finish. He is tall. He is very tall, by the standards of Japanese men of this period. Tall in the specific and immediately visible way that a person is tall when the difference in height between them and the people around them is large enough that it registers before anything else, before the face or the bearing or the quality of movement, as simply the first and most basic fact of the physical presence. And his skin is the darkness of a night sky, the darkness of ink freshly ground on the stone, a darkness that the people of Sakai in the year 1579 have no category for, have no prior experience that would allow them to receive it as simply one variation among the many variations that human bodies produce. Because the people of Sakai in the year 1579 have not seen this before, have not seen anything close to this before, and the absence of a category for the thing you are seeing is the condition that produces the specific and overwhelming quality of response that the crowd at Sakai produces on this afternoon. They come from everywhere. The word moves through Sakai the way extraordinary things move through port cities, which is to say faster than the person the word is about can walk. Ahead of him through the streets and into the houses and up through the neighbourhoods that climb the hill above the harbour, so that by the time the procession from the ship has moved any distance at all into the city, the people who are not at the dock have already heard something and are already moving toward the something they heard, already joining the crowd that is forming around the specific and mobile point of maximum strangeness that is moving through their city on this afternoon. The Jesuit accounts describe what happens next with the specific quality of writers who are simultaneously the source of the information and the people most directly affected by what the information describes. Valignano's records, the letters and the reports that the Jesuit order sent back to Rome and to the provincial headquarters in Goa, describe a crowd of thousands pressing against the walls and the gates of the places where the procession stopped, pressing with the specific and frightening quality of crowds that have lost their individual organization and become something more unified and less governable, a single entity with the simple and overwhelming desire to see the thing that the word described, to verify with direct experience what the word could only approximately convey. Men were injured in the pressing. The accounts note this with the matter-of-fact quality of writers who are describing events rather than editorializing about them, noting the injuries as evidence of the scale of the response rather than as a moral problem requiring comment. The crowd pressed hard enough against the gates that people at the front were crushed against the wood by the weight of the people behind them, who were pressed forward by the weight of the people behind them. The physics of concentrated human curiosity expressing itself in the specific and unglamorous way that physics always expresses itself, which is to say, without regard for the welfare of the individual bodies through which it is operating. Yasuke moves through this with the bearing of a man who has learned, somewhere in the years before this arrival in Japan, that the response his presence produces in the people around him is not something he can change by adjusting his behavior, that the response belongs to the people having it rather than to him, that the only thing available to him in these moments is the quality of presence he brings to them, the specific and chosen quality of a person who has decided to be entirely here for whatever is happening, rather than somewhere else inside himself, where the happening cannot reach. What that decision cost him, or whether it was a decision at all, rather than simply the only available option, is something the accounts cannot tell us. The record is very good at describing what people saw when they looked at Yasuke, and very poor at describing what Yasuke saw when he looked back. This asymmetry is one of the things about the story that the people who tell it 500 years later find most worth sitting with. The specific and honest imbalance of a historical record that was kept by people who were not him, and that reflects, in its structure and its emphases and its silences, the perspective of the people who were watching rather than the perspective of the person being watched. He arrived in Japan as an object of extraordinary curiosity. This is the first fact the record gives us, and it is a fact worth holding with some care, because curiosity is not cruelty. and curiosity is not contempt. But curiosity is also not quite respect, is not the quality of engagement that a person brings to another person they recognize as fully equivalent to themselves, is something that contains within it, however gently and however genuinely it is felt, the specific and structural distance between the person who is curious and the thing the curiosity is directed at. He was the most looked at person in Sakai on this afternoon, and possibly the most looked at person in Japan in this year. And what the looking felt like from the inside is the question that the record, for all its detail about everything else, does not answer. The crowd presses close, and somewhere at the center of it, a tall man with ink-dark skin moves through the city that has never seen him coming with the specific and unremarkable solidity of someone who has decided that being here, completely and honestly here, is the only thing available, and therefore the only thing worth doing. The rumors begin before the crowd has finished gathering. This is how it works in a world without the mechanisms of rapid verification, without the specific and democratizing technology that allows a claim to be checked against reality before it has already traveled far enough to feel like established fact. The word that moves through Sakai ahead of Yasuke is the word of people who saw and tried to describe what they saw, and found that the description required either the admission of having seen something they had no category for, or the imposition of a category that was available but wrong. And most people, in most situations, prefer the wrong category to the honest admission. The category that Sakai reaches for is paint. He has painted himself, the rumor says, or someone has painted him, covered the natural skin with a darkness that is not the darkness of the person beneath it, but a substance applied to the surface. A darkness that is therefore not real, in the way that the darkness of a man who was born with it would be real, but artificial, temporary, verifiable by the simple and direct method of trying to remove it. This rumor has a specific quality that is worth attending to, the quality of a thought that reveals more about the person thinking it than about the thing being thought about, that tells us something true about the limits of the framework available to the people of Sakai in 1579 for understanding what they were seeing, and the specific and human tendency to explain the inexplicable by reference to the explicable, even when the explanation is clearly insufficient. The rubbing would come later. The specific and strange fact that Oda Nobunaga, when he eventually met Yasuke, had him stripped to the waist and his skin scrubbed with water to verify that the darkness was not applied. This fact has attracted more commentary than almost any other detail in the Yasuke story, has been used as evidence for various and sometimes contradictory propositions about Nobunaga's character and his relationship to the foreign and the unknown, and the specific quality of his curiosity about both. What it is most honestly evidence of is the specific and practical empiricism of a man who had spent his entire career in an environment where the gap between appearance and reality was exploited constantly and lethally, who had survived in that environment by the consistent application of the principle that the only reliable information is information verified directly, rather than received through intermediaries whose accuracy and motives cannot be fully controlled. He wanted to know, not to humiliate, not to perform skepticism for an audience, not to make a statement about his relationship to foreigners or to the Jesuit mission, or to the specific and complicated politics of foreign presence in Japan at this moment in its history. He wanted to know if what he was seeing was what it appeared to be, and the wanting to know was organized around the simple and direct method of finding out that his temperament preferred, which was the method of checking rather than assuming, of applying the test rather than accepting the result before the test. The test came back negative. The darkness did not come away. The skin beneath the scrubbing was the same darkness as the skin before it. and Nobunaga received this information with the specific quality of a man who has asked a question and received an answer, and is now in the process of deciding what the answer means and what to do with it. He laughed. The accounts preserve this detail with the care that significant details receive in accounts that understand what is significant. And the laugh is significant in the way that Nobunaga's laughter is always significant, which is to say, it is not the comfortable laughter of a person whose expectations have been met, but the specific and interested laughter of a person who has been genuinely and pleasantly surprised by the world, who has encountered something that his extensive experience of encountering things did not prepare him for, and who finds in the encounter not threat or discomfort, but the specific and sustaining quality of a world that is still larger than his knowledge of it. But that meeting was still weeks ahead. For now there was only the harbour, and the crowd, and the afternoon light, and the man moving through it. Valignano understands immediately that what is happening in Sakai is significant, in ways that go beyond the immediate and practical problem of moving through a city that has temporarily lost its organizational coherence in response to the presence of one of his companions. He is a strategic thinker, Valignano, a man who has been working in Asia long enough to understand that the Jesuit mission's success depends not on the quality of its theology, which he is confident about, but on the quality of its relationships with the people who hold power in the places where the mission operates. And the quality of those relationships depends in turn on the Jesuits' ability to understand those places clearly enough to know what will and will not work within them. He has been in Japan long enough to understand that Japan is different from the other places in Asia where the mission has tried to establish itself. Different in ways that require different approaches, that cannot be treated as simply another version of the colonial relationship between European Christianity and Asian societies, that works imperfectly and coercively in other contexts. Japan in 1579 is a country with its own deep and sophisticated culture, its own fully developed aesthetic and philosophical and martial traditions, its own sense of what constitutes excellence and what constitutes the appropriate relationship between a person of quality and the acknowledgement of quality by the world. The Japanese lords who the Jesuit mission needs to cultivate are not going to be impressed by the fact of European origin or Christian affiliation, are going to be impressed by exactly what impresses them in their own tradition, which is genuine and demonstrable excellence in whatever domain is relevant to the relationship. Yasuke is, in this context, something that Valignano could not have planned and would not have known how to plan. A resource whose value is of a completely different kind from the trade goods and the astronomical instruments and the theological arguments that the mission has been using to establish itself in Japan. He is a demonstration of the world's variety, a living argument for the scale and the range of the world that Christianity claims to speak to and for, a visible and undeniable evidence of the specific and vast reach of the European ships and the European missions and the European God whose representatives are standing here in Sakai on this afternoon, watching the city come apart with curiosity. Whether Yasuke understood any of this, whether he had any awareness of the specific and complex role he was playing in the Jesuit mission's strategy for establishing itself in Japan, is not something the record tells us. What the record tells us is that he was there, that his presence produced the response it produced, and that the response was noticed and noted by the people whose accounts we have, which is to say, by Valignano, and by the other Jesuits who were present, and by the Japanese converts, and the interpreters, and the various people whose function was to observe and transmit, and whose transmissions are the primary source for everything we know about this moment. The afternoon light changes as the day moves toward evening. The crowd does not entirely disperse, but shifts, reorganizes itself around the new reality that Yasuke's presence in Sakai has become, around the fact of him rather than the shock of him. The shock having been absorbed enough by now that what remains is the sustained and particular quality of attention that extraordinary things generate after the initial response has spent itself. The quality of wanting to look again, and then again. Of finding that each looking produces something slightly different from the last, because the looker has changed slightly in the looking, has accumulated with each look a small additional increment of whatever understanding looking at something very long and very carefully eventually produces. He is being looked at, and somewhere behind the being looked at, in the interior that the record cannot reach, a person is experiencing the first day of the life that Japan will give him, and taking it in with whatever quality of attention the years before this day have produced in him, receiving the harbour and the crowd and the evening light and the salt and cedar smell of a port city in a country he has never been in before, with the specific and grounded quality of a person who has learned, wherever and however the learning happened, to be present for what is actually here. The meeting with Nobunaga is arranged through the mechanisms that all significant meetings in this period are arranged through, which is to say, through the specific and careful negotiation of intermediaries who understand the protocols of access and the specific and serious consequences of getting the protocols wrong. Valignano has been working toward this meeting since before the ship arrived in Sakai Harbour, has been building through letters and introductions and the careful cultivation of the relationships that provide access to the relationships that provide access to the man at the centre of everything the meeting requires. Oda Nobunaga in 1581 is not the same man who received the first Jesuit missionaries to Japan 2 decades earlier, though he is, in some respects, the logical extension of that man, the product of the specific and violent process of becoming the most powerful lord in Japan, a process that has required and produced and revealed in him qualities that the earlier version of himself only gestured toward. He has unified more of the country than any lord since Hideyoshi's predecessor, has done it through a combination of military genius and political ruthlessness, and the specific and unusual willingness to discard the conventions of his tradition when the conventions conflicted with the results his strategy required. He is not a conventional man in any respect, and the unconventional man's relationship to the foreign and the strange and the category disrupting is different from the conventional man's relationship to these things, is organized around the specific and interested quality of a person for whom the disruption of categories is not a threat, but a resource. He receives Yasuke at Azuchi Castle. The castle that Nobunaga has built on the shores of Lake Biwa is itself an argument, an architectural statement about what kind of man has built it, and what kind of power he represents. Built taller and more visible and more deliberately impressive than anything the Japanese castle tradition had previously produced. Organized around the principle that the person who controls the highest point in the landscape controls the landscape's understanding of where power lives. Yasuke walks into this argument on a day in 1581, and Nobunaga looks at him with the specific and total quality of attention that the most serious men of this period bring to things they have decided are worth their full attention. He orders the scrubbing. The accounts describe this with the matter-of-fact brevity of a detail that was already well known to the people the accounts were written for, a detail that required no elaboration, because the elaboration was available in the shared knowledge of the audience. Yasuke submits to the examination with the quality of a person who has been the subject of examinations before, and who understands that this particular examination is being conducted by a man whose curiosity is genuine and whose methods are direct, and who is not performing skepticism for an audience, but simply doing what his temperament requires when it encounters a claim it wants to verify. The darkness does not come away. Nobunaga looks at the result for a moment with the specific quality of a man who has asked a question and received an answer that he finds interesting, that opens rather than closes the inquiry, that replaces one question with several others, all of them more interesting than the one they replace. And then he laughs. The laugh is real. The accounts agree on this. Real in the way that Nobunaga's significant reactions are real, which is to say, unmistakable, unperformed. The genuine response of a man who has just encountered something that has made the world briefly and specifically larger than it was a moment before. He asks questions through the interpreters. What is this man? Where does he come from? What is the name of the place? How far away is it? Is there a country of people who look like this? The questions have the quality of a mind that is genuinely engaged, that is not going through the motions of polite curiosity, but is actually trying to understand something, actually assembling from the available information a picture of a world whose dimensions this encounter has revealed to be larger than the picture previously contained. Yasuke answers. The accounts do not preserve the specific words, do not give us the direct transcript of this first conversation between the man who would become his lord and the man who would become, in the years ahead, something that the Japanese record had no prior category for. What they preserve is the fact of the conversation, the specific and significant fact that Nobunaga found in Yasuke someone worth talking to, found in the answers to his questions a quality of directness and intelligence that his tradition associated with men of standing, found in the bearing and the presence something that his tradition recognized, even when the surface of the thing presenting it was unlike anything his tradition had encountered. The laughter has settled into something quieter and more serious. Nobunaga is looking at Yasuke with the specific and focused quality of a man who has just made a decision, or is in the process of making a decision, the kind that does not announce itself as a decision, but arrives as simply the next thing, the obvious thing, the thing that the quality of the person in front of him and the quality of his own nature together produce without the need for deliberation. The meeting is not over. It is, in the most honest sense, just beginning. Shh. Just breathe. The castle is quiet around you. The lake beyond the windows holds the last of the evening light in the specific and unhurried way that large bodies of water hold light, receiving it and giving it back changed, softer, more diffuse, less like the light of a specific place and more like the light of simply being here, in this room, in this moment, in the first real conversation of the life that Japan is going to give him. Let that carry you. Good night. There is a specific kind of man who is not frightened by the things that frighten other men. And the specific kind of man is not brave in the conventional sense, not the man who feels the fear and proceeds anyway, who carries the weight of the fear through the action and endures the carrying because the action requires it. The man who is not frightened by the things that frighten other men is organized differently, at a more fundamental level, is built around a relationship to the unknown. That is not the relationship of a person who must manage their fear of it, but the relationship of a person who finds in it the specific and sustaining quality of a world that has not yet been fully mapped, that still contains territory worth exploring, that can still produce on any given afternoon something that makes the landscape of the known feel briefly and specifically smaller than it was before the afternoon began. Oda Nobunaga is this kind of man. This is one of the things about him that his contemporaries found most difficult to account for, and that the historians who have been writing about him for 4 centuries have found most consistently worth returning to. Because it is one of the things that most directly explains how he became what he became. How a lord from a middle-ranking family in a middle-ranking province arrived at the position of having unified more of Japan than any man since the country began tearing itself apart, and having done it in ways that his tradition did not predict, and his contemporaries did not see coming, until the coming was already complete. He was not supposed to be this. The young Nobunaga was known in his home province of Owari as the Fool of Owari, the lord's son who walked through the streets eating food from street vendors and wearing his clothes half-tied, and conducting himself with the specific and deliberately unconventional energy of a person who has decided, at an age when most people are still deciding what the conventions are, that the conventions are not the thing, that the thing is somewhere else, that the somewhere else is worth finding, even if the finding requires the sacrifice of every social comfort that conformity to convention provides. His father saw something in the foolishness that the province did not see, or chose to trust the something he saw over the evidence that the province was presenting. And the choice turned out to be one of the more consequential parental decisions in the history of the country. The man who received Yasuke at Azuchi Castle in 1581 was the product of 40 years of the specific and violent education that becoming Nobunaga required. 40 years of battle and strategy, and the specific and relentless work of dismantling every obstacle between the position he occupied and the position he was moving toward. 40 years of making decisions that the conventions of his world said could not or should not be made, and finding that the decisions, however unconventional, produced results that the conventional alternatives could not have produced. He had used firearms in mass formation before any other Japanese commander, had dismantled the institutional power of the Buddhist temples that had been acting as political actors for generations, had built a castle that violated every established principle of what a castle should be, and where it should be built, and what it should look like when it was finished. He was a man who had been disagreeing with the available categories for his entire life, and the disagreement had made him, in the most practical and demonstrable sense, the most powerful man in Japan. Yasuke walked into the presence of this man on a day in 1581, and Nobunaga looked at him with the specific and total quality of attention that this kind of man brings to a new category. The attention that is not performing interest, but actually experiencing it. That is not organized around the social requirements of the meeting, but around the genuine and immediate question of what the thing in front of him is and what it means. The examination begins with the eyes. This is always where Nobunaga's examinations begin, with the specific and unhurried quality of a man who has learned that the first and most important instrument of assessment is the direct and unmediated observation of the thing itself, before the interpreters have translated, and before the intermediaries have contextualized, and before the protocols of the meeting have organized the encounter into the shape that protocols are designed to produce, which is the shape of a managed and predictable exchange, rather than the shape of a genuine and potentially surprising one. He is sitting when Yasuke enters, or the accounts suggest he is sitting, in the specific and deliberate way that lords of his standing sit in formal settings, with the quality of settled authority that the position itself produces in a person who has inhabited the position long enough that the authority is no longer something worn, but something simply present, as much a part of the physical bearing as the posture and the stillness and the specific quality of gaze that belongs to a man who has been the most important person in every room he has entered for the last decade and a half. He looks. The looking lasts longer than the looking at a new thing usually lasts, longer than the brief and organizing assessment that a person performs when they encounter something unfamiliar and need to quickly place it within the available categories, so that the encounter can proceed along the lines that encounters with placed things proceed along. It lasts longer because the available categories are not working, because the thing in front of him is producing in his mind the specific and slightly vertiginous quality of something that keeps sliding off the edges of the frameworks he is trying to apply to it, that won't stay inside the descriptions that his experience and his knowledge of the world are offering as candidates for what it is. He stands. The accounts note this as significant, and it is significant, because a lord of Nobunaga's standing and temperament does not stand for things that don't require standing for, does not reorganize his physical relationship to the world around him, unless the world around him has produced something that the seated relationship is not adequate to encounter properly. He crosses the room with the specific and unhurried quality of a man who has decided that the distance between himself and the thing he wants to understand is an obstacle to understanding, and that the obstacle should simply be removed. He reaches out a hand. The gesture is so direct and so completely without the mediation of protocol that the people in the room who are responsible for managing the protocols of the meeting are for a moment simply observers, watching something happen that their function does not cover, that falls outside the categories of what formal meetings between lords and visitors are supposed to contain. Nobunaga touches Yasuke's arm with the specific and matter-of-fact quality of a man who wants to know what something feels like and has decided that the way to find out what something feels like is to feel it. The skin is warm and solid and real in the way that all skin is warm and solid and real, in the way that the most basic physical facts of other people's bodies are real when you are close enough to them to receive the specific and grounding evidence of their physical presence, the warmth and the texture and the specific quality of contact that the hand receives when it touches another person and registers, below the level of thought, the irreducible and important fact of another body in the world. Nobunaga takes this in and then does what his nature does when it has received information that the available frameworks don't fully account for. He calls for water. The scrubbing is ordered with the specific and direct quality of a man who has identified the next necessary step in an investigation and is proceeding to it without the hesitation that uncertainty would produce, because he is not uncertain, is simply thorough, is applying to this situation the same empirical principle he has applied to every significant decision of his career, which is the principle that the evidence you verify yourself is the only evidence you can fully trust, and that the gap between what appears to be true and what is actually true is the gap that has killed more lords than any army. The Jesuit accounts describe the scene with the slightly awkward quality of writers who are recording something that their own cultural framework does not have a clean category for, something that is not cruelty and not ceremony and not quite either of the things that the available vocabulary wants to make it. Valignano is present, or the records suggest he is present, watching with the specific and attentive quality of a man who understands that what is happening in this room is potentially significant in ways that go beyond the immediate and physical. That the outcome of this encounter between the most powerful lord in Japan and the man he brought across half the world is going to determine something important about the Jesuit mission's future in this country. Yasuke submits to the examination with the quality that the accounts describe, which is the quality of a person who has submitted to versions of this examination before, who has been the subject of the specific and various ways that the world tries to verify what it thinks it is seeing when it looks at him, who has learned or developed or simply arrived at the specific and grounded quality of not organizing his sense of himself around the examinations and their outcomes, of being present for the examination without the examination being the thing his presence is organized around. The water is brought. The cloth is applied to the skin of his arms and his chest, and the specific and vigorous motion of the scrubbing proceeds with the quality that the order requires, which is to say seriously, which is to say with enough force, that if there is anything on the surface that the force can remove, the force will remove it, which is to say as an actual test rather than a performance of a test. Nothing comes away. The skin under the scrubbing is the same darkness as the skin before it, and the cloth held up to Nobunaga shows nothing, or shows only the specific and unremarkable evidence of a cloth that has been applied to clean skin and has collected what clean skin gives to cloth, which is not ink and not paint, and not any applied substance, but simply the honest and irreducible fact of the person whose skin it is. Nobunaga looks at the cloth for a moment, and then he looks at Yasuke, and then he laughs. The laugh is the thing that the accounts return to, the detail that everyone who has written about this moment in the 4 centuries since it happened has found worth preserving and worth discussing and worth trying to understand. Because the laugh is not a simple thing, is not the single clear note that the word laugh suggests, but something more various and more interesting, something that contains within it several things simultaneously, and that therefore cannot be fully explained by any single explanation, however accurate that explanation might be within its own terms. The laugh contains surprise. This is the first and most obvious thing it contains, the specific and genuine quality of a man who has been surprised, who has encountered something that his extensive and hard-won knowledge of the world did not prepare him for, who has run his verification procedure and received a result that is not the result that the procedure was designed to produce, that is not the revelation of a deception, but the confirmation of a reality that is stranger and more interesting than the deception would have been. He has seen the Portuguese before, has been engaging with Jesuit missionaries for years, has developed through that engagement a specific and practical understanding of the European world and its representatives, their ships and their weapons and their God, and their specific and useful combination of technological sophistication and cultural confidence. He has seen Africans before, in the sense that the Portuguese ships that arrived in Japanese ports sometimes carried African crew members whose presence was noted and recorded by the Japanese observers who kept records of the things that arrived by ship. But he has not seen this, has not seen this specific combination of physical presence and bearing, and the quality of stillness that Yasuke carries, has not encountered before the particular and specific reality of this person standing in his room on this afternoon. The laugh contains delight. This is the second thing, harder to separate from the surprise, but distinct from it in the specific way that delight is distinct from surprise, which is that surprise is about the gap between expectation and reality, and delight is about what fills the gap, about the quality of the thing that the surprise has introduced into the world. Nobunaga is delighted by the world's variety, in the specific and personal way of a man who has been paying close attention to the world's variety for his entire life, and who finds in each new evidence of it a confirmation of the proposition that has been organizing his engagement with the world since the streets of Owari. The proposition that the world is larger and more various and more interesting than the available categories for it suggest. That the categories are always approximately right and never completely right, and that the approximately right is never a reason to stop looking for the more completely right that the looking might eventually produce. The laugh contains something else, something that is harder to name and that the accounts approach without quite landing on, something that is not surprise and not delight, but the specific and quiet quality of a recognition, of a person encountering something that their nature has always been oriented toward, without knowing what it would look like when it arrived. Something that says yes in a register below the level of conscious affirmation, that rearranges something in the interior without making the rearrangement explicit. Nobunaga has spent his entire career disagreeing with the available categories. He has spent 40 years being the person who insisted that the thing everyone said was impossible was not impossible, that the thing everyone said should be done one way could be done better another way, that the tradition everyone said was sacred could be dismantled and replaced with something that worked better, without the world ending as a result of the dismantling. He has built his entire identity and his entire strategy around the specific and productive refusal to be limited by the categories that the world offered him. And here, in his room at Azuchi Castle, on an afternoon in 1581, is a person who disrupts every category the world has available for him, who cannot be placed within any of the frameworks that the room's other occupants are using to organize their understanding of what is present, who is simply and completely outside the taxonomy, the specific and embodied demonstration of the proposition that the world is always larger than the maps that have been made of it. Nobunaga recognizes this the way a person recognizes a principle they have been living by when they see it expressed in a form they did not anticipate. He laughs the way a person laughs when the world has done something right. What happens after the laugh is the part of the story that the historians spend the most time with. Because what happens after the laugh is the part that has the most historical consequence, that determines the shape of the years ahead and the specific and unprecedented position that Yasuke will come to occupy in the structure of the most powerful court in Japan. Nobunaga asks questions. The questions come through the interpreters, with the specific quality of questions that are genuinely trying to understand something, rather than performing the ritual of inquiry that formal meetings require. Questions that follow each answer toward the next question, with the focused and sequential quality of a mind that is building something from the information it is receiving, assembling from the fragments of Yasuke's history and origin and experience, a picture of a world that Nobunaga has been receiving pieces of for years through the Jesuit intermediaries, and that he is now, for the first time, receiving directly from the person who came from it and walked through it, and arrived here carrying it in his body and his bearing, and the specific quality of presence that the room has been organized around since he entered it. Where do you come from? The question is simple, and the answer is not simple. Is the answer of a person trying to describe a place to someone who has no reference points for the description, trying to find in the vocabulary available to the meeting the words that will make the distance and the difference legible to a man who has never been further from Japan than the Korean peninsula, and who is receiving the geography of Africa through an interpreter translating from a language that is not the language Yasuke thinks in, into a language that is not the language Nobunaga thinks in. The information passing through multiple filters before it arrives at its destination, and losing something at each filter, and arriving nevertheless as something, as the specific and approximate and genuinely received impression of a world that is very far away and very real. Nobunaga listens with the quality of attention that the accounts note across multiple encounters with him. The quality of a man who is actually listening, rather than waiting for the talking to end so that he can speak. Who is using the time of another person's speech to actually process what the speech contains, rather than to organize what he is going to say next. The interpreter speaks, and Nobunaga's expression shifts in the specific and micro-visible ways that genuine engagement shifts a face. The small adjustments of attention and understanding, and the particular quality of interest that deepens, rather than maintains itself, across the course of a conversation that is going somewhere. He has Yasuke demonstrate his strength. The accounts describe this with the matter-of-fact brevity of a detail that was unremarkable to the people present. A practical and direct assessment of the practical and direct qualities of a person who is being considered for a specific kind of role. The role of the person who is physically present with the Lord in the specific and various situations that require the Lord to have someone physically present who is capable of meeting whatever the situations present. Yasuke lifts what is asked of him to be lifted. He demonstrates what is asked of him to be demonstrated. The demonstration has the quality of evidence, rather than performance, of a person who is showing what is actually there, rather than constructing an impression of what is there. Nobunaga watches all of this, and arrives, in the specific and direct way that he arrives at decisions, at a conclusion about what the next thing is. The conclusion is this: the man who laughed at the cloth that showed nothing is going to keep the man who made the cloth show nothing. Not as a curiosity, not as an exhibit, not as the kind of foreign presence that lords of this period sometimes maintained for the specific and political purpose of demonstrating their cosmopolitan sophistication to the other lords who visited and were meant to be impressed by the demonstration. As something else. As something that the Japanese record does not yet have a word for, but that Nobunaga, who has spent his entire career creating things the Japanese record did not have words for, is in the process of deciding to create. Just breathe. The castle is quiet around you. The lake beyond the walls is doing what lakes do in the last of the evening light, holding the sky in its surface with the specific and unhurried patience of something that has been doing this since before the castle was built. and will continue doing it long after the castle is memory. And in the room where the meeting happened, the Lord who laughed is sitting, with the specific and settled quality of a man who has made a decision that he finds interesting, that opens rather than closes the possibilities of the days ahead. And somewhere near him, in the specific and unfamiliar geography of the most powerful court in Japan, a man from very far away is doing what he has been doing since the ship came into Sakai Harbor. Being here. Completely. Good night. A name is not a simple thing. This is easy to forget in the ordinary course of a life in which the name was given before the person was present to receive it, in which the name arrived with the birth and has been so continuously and completely attached to the person since the beginning that the attachment feels natural, feels like the name and the person are the same thing, rather than two things that have been connected by the specific and consequential decision of other people who had their own reasons for the connection they made. A name given at birth is a name that the person grows into, that the person's life gradually fills with the specific and various content of everything that happens to them, and everything they do, and everything they become, until the name and the content are so thoroughly fused that separating them requires an act of deliberate imagination. A name given to an adult is different. A name given to an adult is a statement about the person who is giving it and the person who is receiving it, and the specific and consequential relationship between the two that the giving and the receiving creates. A statement that is made not in the language of words, but in the language of the act itself, in the specific and public quality of a naming that happens in a context where the naming means something, where the name arrives not as a neutral label, but as a declaration, as the Lord's public assertion that the person being named is now located within the Lord's world in a specific way, that the name is the mechanism by which the location is established and made legible to everyone who witnesses or hears about the naming. Nobunaga gives Yasuke a name sometime in the months after the meeting at Azuchi Castle, and the giving of the name is one of the things about the story that the people who tell it 500 years later find most worth pausing over, most worth sitting with in the specific and careful way that details require when they are small on the surface and large underneath, when the surface simplicity conceals a depth of implication that reveals itself only to the attention that is willing to go below the surface and stay there long enough to understand what is present. The name is Yasuke. The origin of the name is not entirely clear, which is itself informative, because the names that lords give to people in this period are not arbitrary, are not the random assignment of sounds to a person for the convenience of having something to call them, but are deliberate and considered acts that carry within them specific meanings and associations, and the specific quality of intention that serious naming in this culture always carries. Some scholars suggest the name is a Japanese rendering of the name he came with, a phonetic approximation of an African or Portuguese name that the Japanese sound system has received and reshaped into a form that the Japanese mouth can produce and the Japanese ear can hold. Others suggest it is a name of purely Japanese construction, given without reference to the name he arrived with, a new name for a new situation, the specific and clean start that a new name in a new world can represent. What is clear is that Nobunaga gave it, and that the giving was a beginning. The court at Azuchi in the years around 1581 is one of the most remarkable environments in the history of Japan. Which is to say, it is one of the most remarkable environments in the history of this period of the world. Because what Nobunaga has built on the shores of Lake Biwa is not simply a military headquarters or a center of administrative power, but something more various and more deliberately assembled than either of these. Something that reflects in its composition and its activities, and the specific quality of life that it supports, the specific and various character of the man who built it. The court contains warriors and administrators and merchants and artists and foreign missionaries and Japanese converts, and the various people whose function is to maintain the specific and complicated machinery of a political and military operation that is simultaneously trying to finish unifying the country and trying to figure out what the unified country should become once the unifying is complete. It is a place where the categories that the tradition uses to organize people and their relationships to each other are under constant pressure, where the conventional separations between the warrior class and the merchant class, and the artistic community, and the religious institutions, and the foreign presence are not abolished, but are held more lightly than they are held elsewhere, are subject to the specific and productive disruption that Nobunaga's temperament applies to every category it encounters. Into this environment Yasuke arrives, not as a visitor, not as a companion of the Jesuit mission who is present in the court by virtue of his association with people who have been granted access, but as a member of the household, as a person whose connection to the court is now direct and personal, organized around the specific and consequential relationship between himself and the Lord, rather than around the mediated and contingent relationship between himself and the institution that the Lord has been cultivating. The transition from visitor to member of the household is not a bureaucratic process, is not organized around the formal instruments of appointment and registration that the administrative machinery of the domain uses to manage its personnel. It is organized around the Lord's decision, around the specific and sovereign quality of Nobunaga's authority to determine who belongs within the circle of his direct personal attendance and who does not. An authority that is absolute in the way that the authority of the most powerful lord in Japan in 1581 is absolute, which is to say it is not subject to appeal or to the moderating influence of precedent or tradition, or the opinion of the people whose own categories the decision disrupts. He is given a room. The accounts note this with the brevity that the accounts bring to things that are practically significant, but not dramatically eventful. The brevity of a fact being recorded rather than a scene being described. A room in the Lord's household is not a neutral thing, is not simply a physical space provided for the convenience of its occupant, but a statement about the occupant's relationship to the household and the Lord's relationship to the occupant, a legible and public declaration of where the person belongs in the specific and carefully organized hierarchy of people who have access to the Lord's presence and the Lord's space. Yasuke's room is close to Nobunaga's own quarters. This detail, which the accounts preserve without elaborating on its significance, because the significance was legible to the people for whom the accounts were written without elaboration, is the kind of detail that repays the attention of people reading 500 years later. Because the significance of proximity in the organization of a lord's household in this period is very large, is organized around the principle that the people closest to the Lord are the people the Lord trusts most completely, the people whose presence in the vicinity of the Lord's person is a statement about the quality of the relationship between them and the specific kind of access and confidence that the relationship provides. He is close. This is the first statement the court makes about what Yasuke is going to be. The sword arrives separately from the name, but belongs to the same act, or to the same sequence of acts that the act of naming initiates. the sequence by which a decision that exists initially only in the Lord's intention is made real in the world through the specific and material forms that decisions of this kind take in this culture. The forms that are not simply symbolic, but are the thing itself, are the mechanism by which the intention becomes a fact, rather than remaining a preference. A sword given by Nobunaga to a person in his household is not a gift in the sense that the word gift usually carries, not the expression of affection or gratitude, or the specific and social quality of generosity that gift-giving in ordinary contexts represents. It is a statement of status, a material declaration of where the recipient stands in the hierarchy of people who bear arms in the Lord's service. A legible and portable and entirely unambiguous signal to everyone who sees it of the specific and consequential relationship between the person carrying it and the person who gave it to them. The sword that Nobunaga gives Yasuke is, by the accounts that describe it, a long sword, a weapon appropriate to a man of serious standing, rather than a short sword appropriate to a man of lesser position. A weapon whose length and quality communicate immediately and without words to everyone who sees it carried at Yasuke's side, the specific message that the Lord intends to communicate, which is the message that this person is not what the available categories for foreign visitors to Japanese courts suggest, is not a curiosity or a companion of the missionary, or the exotic element of a sophisticated lord's cosmopolitan collection, but something that the available categories do not have a clean word for, and that the sword is standing in for, while the situation develops enough to require and produce the word. He carries it. The accounts that describe Yasuke in the months after the naming and the sword describe a person who has made the adjustment that the carrying requires, the specific and internal adjustment of a person who is holding something that changes the way the world encounters them, that changes what the world expects of the person holding it, before the person has done anything to meet or disappoint the expectation. The sword changes the encounter before the encounter begins, and the person carrying the sword must decide, consciously or not, what relationship they are going to have with the change it produces, whether they are going to organize themselves around the change, or simply carry the thing and let the change happen around them, while they remain organized around whatever they were organized around before. Yasuke carries it the second way, or the accounts suggest he carries it the second way, with the specific and grounded quality of a person who has accepted the new situation without being reorganized by it, who is wearing the new identity the sword confers without the identity wearing him, who remains inside whatever he was before the sword arrived, while also being, now and permanently, and in a way that everyone who sees the sword can read, something different. The court watches. The court always watches when the Lord does something unprecedented, and this is unprecedented, is a thing that the court cannot locate within the categories available to it for understanding what it is seeing. And the inability to locate a thing within available categories is one of the conditions that produces the most attentive watching, because the categories are the mechanism by which watching is converted into understanding, and when the categories fail, the watching must continue until the situation has resolved itself into something the categories can hold. The court watches, and Yasuke carries the sword through the spaces of Azuchi Castle with the specific and unremarked quality of a person who is doing what the situation requires, and not performing his doing of it. And the performance of not performing is itself, in an environment where everything is watched and everything is interpreted, and the distance between action and its meaning is very short, a kind of statement. The question of what Yasuke is in the structure of Nobunaga's court is a question that the court itself is asking, in the specific and continuous way that institutions ask questions about the things they cannot categorize, which is to say, not in formal deliberation or explicit inquiry, but in the accumulated and ongoing adjustment of behavior that people make when the expected categories are not available, and the actual situation must be navigated with whatever understanding can be assembled from the available evidence. The warriors in Nobunaga's service have a specific and elaborately organized relationship to each other, and to the Lord, that is structured around the concept of the samurai, around the specific and complex set of obligations and privileges and social meanings that the word carries in this period and this culture. Meanings that are not simply about fighting, not simply about the technical capacity for violence that any sufficiently strong and sufficiently trained person can develop, but about the specific and accumulated weight of a tradition that connects the person bearing arms to a lineage of people who bore arms before them, that locates the individual warrior within a history and a set of relationships that give the individual's bearing of arms its social and moral significance. Yasuke has none of this lineage. He has no family name that connects him to the Japanese warrior tradition, no record of ancestors who bore arms in the service of Japanese lords, no position within the specific and elaborate hierarchy of obligation and loyalty that structures the relationships between warriors and lords in this period. What he has is the sword that Nobunaga gave him, and the proximity to the Lord that the room near the Lord's quarters represents, and the name that the Lord chose for him, and the specific and various qualities of physical presence and bearing, and apparent capability that the Lord observed, and found sufficient reason for the giving of all of the above. Is this enough to make him a samurai? The question is not one that the court can answer easily, because the category of samurai in this period is not a simple binary, but a spectrum, is not a gate that is either open or closed, but a terrain with multiple thresholds and contested boundaries, and the specific and ongoing negotiation between the theoretical requirements of the category and the practical reality of who is actually bearing arms, in whose service, under what conditions. The tradition says one thing about who can be a samurai, and the practical reality of Nobunaga's court says something more complicated, because Nobunaga has spent his entire career doing things that the tradition said couldn't or shouldn't be done, and finding that the things worked anyway, that the tradition's prohibitions were less absolute than the tradition claimed. He treats Yasuke as a warrior. This is the practical answer that the court eventually organizes itself around, the pragmatic resolution of the theoretical question that the theoretical question itself cannot provide, the answer that the situation produces when the situation is allowed to continue long enough that the pattern of what actually happens becomes clearer than the question of what should happen according to the categories. Nobunaga takes Yasuke to battles. He includes him in the specific and select group of people who are present at the Lord's side in the most consequential situations, the situations where the selection of who is present is the most deliberate and the most revealing of the Lord's actual assessment of the people around him. Because in these situations, the selection is not organized around social convention or institutional hierarchy or the management of people's feelings about their standing, but simply around the question of who the Lord wants to have near him when the circumstances are most demanding. The answer includes Yasuke. What does it mean to be given a name and a sword and a room near the Lord's quarters in the most powerful court in Japan, when you arrived 6 months ago on a ship from the other side of the world, with no Japanese and no connection to the tradition that defines what all of these things mean? This is the question that sits beneath the surface of everything the accounts describe about Yasuke's position in Nobunaga's court. The question that the accounts themselves do not ask explicitly, because the accounts were written by people for whom the question had a different shape, for whom the interesting thing was not Yasuke's interior experience of the situation, but the external and observable fact of his presence and the Lord's response to it. The accounts are about what happened. The question underneath them is about what it was like to be the person it happened to. He learned Japanese. This is one of the details that the Jesuit accounts preserve with the specific quality of noting something that surprised them, something that exceeded their expectation of what a person in his situation would or could do, something that impressed them in the way that genuine and rapid acquisition of a difficult language impresses people who understand from their own experience how difficult the acquisition is. He learned it quickly, the accounts suggest, or quickly enough that the speed itself was notable. Quickly enough that within the first year or so of his time in Japan, he was able to communicate directly, rather than through the interpreters who had been the mediators of all his early encounters with the Japanese world. The learning of the language is the learning of the categories. This is the thing that language acquisition does that goes beyond the practical utility of being able to make yourself understood. The thing that makes learning a language different from learning any other skill, which is that the language carries within it the entire weight of the culture that produced it, the specific and various ways that the culture has found to organize experience into communicable form. The categories and the relationships between categories and the hierarchies of importance that the categories reflect and reinforce. To learn Japanese is to learn, at least partially and at least approximately, the Japanese way of organizing the world, including the Japanese way of organizing the question of what Yasuke is and where he belongs in the structure of things. He is acquiring, through the language, the tools to understand his own situation in the terms that the situation itself is organized around. This is a strange and vertiginous thing to imagine. The process of learning the vocabulary that allows you to understand what you have become while you are in the process of becoming it. Learning the word for what the sword means while you are carrying the sword. Learning the specific and complicated implications of proximity to the Lord while you are living in the room that represents the proximity. The name settles over him the way names settle over people who have lived inside them long enough. Yasuke. The sound of it in the mouths of the warriors who pass him in the corridors of Azuchi Castle, and the servants who bring his meals, and the Lord who calls for him with the specific and direct quality of a man who calls for the people he wants, without the ceremonial mediation that protocol would otherwise require. Yasuke. His name, now, in the only way that names become yours, which is through the accumulated repetition of being called by it, in enough contexts, by enough people, with enough different qualities of relationship, that the name stops being something attached to you, and starts being something that is you, that carries within it all of the accumulated specific weight of being this person, in this place, in this time. He is not what he was when the ship came into Sakai Harbor. He is not entirely what the sword and the room and the name say he is either. He is something in between, something that the available categories are not quite adequate to contain, something that the court is still in the process of understanding, and that he himself is still in the process of becoming, in the specific and ongoing way that people are always in the process of becoming whatever the life they find themselves inside is making of them. The sword is at his side. The name is in the air around him. And the lake beyond the castle walls is holding the evening in its surface with the patient and unhurried quality of something that has been receiving the sky for a very long time, and that will continue receiving it long after the names and the swords and the specific and unprecedented situation of one particular man in one particular court in one particular year have become the thing that they are in the process of becoming, which is history, which is the specific and permanent past that the living carry forward as foundation, without always knowing what they are carrying, or why. Shh. Just breathe. The castle is quiet. The sword is still. And somewhere in the room, near the Lord's quarters, a man is lying in the dark with a Japanese name and trying it on from the inside, turning it over in the mind the way you turn over a new thing when you are alone with it and no one is watching, and you can simply be with what it is, without the performance of being with what it is that other people's presence requires. Yasuke. Yes. Good night. There is a specific quality to the center of power in a country that is in the process of being unified by force. A quality that is different from the quality of power in a country that has been settled for long enough that the power has become institutional, that has been converted from the personal authority of the man who took it into the impersonal authority of the systems he built to hold it. The center of Nobunaga's power in the early 1580s is not yet institutional in this way, is still organized primarily around the person, around the specific and various qualities of the man himself, his judgment and his will, and his specific and productive refusal to be limited by the categories his tradition offers him. And the people who move in the circle immediately around that center are moving in the vicinity of something that is both very powerful and still in the process of becoming what it is going to be, still provisional in the specific and slightly vertiginous way of things that have not yet finished arriving at their final form. Yasuke moves in this circle. This is the fact that the accounts establish gradually and then completely across the months and years that follow the naming and the sword and the room near the Lord's quarters. The fact that accumulates from individual instances of observation and record into something that has the weight of a pattern, of a consistent and repeated reality, rather than an occasional and exceptional one. He is present at the audiences that Nobunaga gives to the lords who come to demonstrate their submission and their loyalty. He is present at the meals where the business of the court is conducted in the specific and indirect way that serious business is conducted in formal settings, where the thing being decided is not the thing being discussed, but is present in the room as the organizing logic of everything that is being discussed. He is present on the roads between the castle and the capital, and the various locations that the military and political requirements of the continuing unification require Nobunaga to visit and be seen visiting. He is present the way the most trusted people in a lord's inner circle are present, which is to say, continuously, unremarkably, as part of the specific and familiar texture of the lord's daily life, rather than as a notable addition to it, as one of the people whose presence is so thoroughly expected that their absence would be the thing that registered rather than their presence. This quality of expected presence is one of the more significant things the accounts establish about the nature of Yasuke's position in the court, because it tells us something about the relationship between him and Nobunaga that the more dramatic incidents cannot tell us as clearly, which is something about the quality of the ordinary, about what the days between the notable events were made of, and what the made of ordinariness means about the trust and the comfort and the specific kind of relationship that produces this quality of continuous proximity. The capital is an hour's travel from Azuchi by the roads of this period, or several hours, depending on the specific conditions of the travel and the specific requirements of the occasion. And Nobunaga moves between the castle and Kyoto with the regularity of a man who has business in both places, and who treats the road between them as simply the condition of the business, rather than an interruption of it. Yasuke moves with him. The road between Azuchi and Kyoto in the early 1580s is a road that a great many people travel for a great many reasons. Merchants and pilgrims and administrators and warriors, and the various people whose lives require movement between the political center and the commercial and cultural life of the surrounding region. And the procession of a major lord on this road is itself a kind of statement, a public and visible demonstration of the Lord's power and the quality of the people who move in his immediate attendance. The people who see the procession passing see Yasuke. Kyoto, in the early 1580s, is a city that has been the symbolic center of Japan for centuries, and that has been physically damaged by the wars of the preceding decades in ways that the symbolic centrality has survived, but that the material reality of the city reflects in the specific and visible way that violence leaves its evidence on the built environment. In the gaps where buildings were, and the walls that are not entirely repaired, and the specific quality of a city that is in the process of recovering from something and has not yet fully recovered. Nobunaga has been investing in the city's reconstruction, has been converting his military dominance in the region into the specific and visible form of civic improvement that lords who intend to stay use to demonstrate their intention, building and rebuilding the structures that make a city what it is, and that make the lord who builds them the person the city associates with its own renewal. The streets of this city receive Yasuke with the specific and various quality of reception that a city gives to something it has not encountered before, something that does not fit the categories available to the people who encounter it, and that therefore cannot be processed with the efficient and unreflective speed that familiar things are processed with, that requires instead the slower and more effortful engagement of genuine attention, the engagement that begins with looking and continues past looking into something that is closer to trying to understand. He is tall in a city of people who are not tall. He is dark in a city whose understanding of human variety does not include this darkness. He is moving through the streets in the immediate attendance of the most powerful lord in the country, which means he is moving through the streets with the specific quality of a person whose proximity to power is visible in every element of the context that surrounds him, in the people who move around him and the space that is created around the procession, and the specific and legible quality of armed attendance that marks the procession as the procession of someone significant. The people of Kyoto look. The looking has a different quality from the looking of Sakai 3 years earlier, or some of it does, because some of the people of Kyoto have seen him before, have seen the procession pass through their streets on previous occasions, have had enough encounters with the fact of him to have moved past the initial and overwhelming quality of the first encounter into something that is still attention, but is organized attention rather than stunned attention. Attention that is trying to understand rather than simply trying to absorb the fact of what is present. But some of the people seeing the procession are seeing it for the first time, and for them, the quality of looking is the quality of Sakai again, the specific and involuntary reorganization of attention that the presence of something outside the available categories produces in every person who encounters it, regardless of how sophisticated their relationship to the foreign and the unfamiliar generally is. A Portuguese Jesuit writing in this period describes the response to Yasuke's presence in the streets of Kyoto with the specific and slightly uncomfortable quality of a writer who is trying to be accurate about something that his own cultural framework does not provide entirely clean vocabulary for. The people press close, the account says. They call out. They follow the procession further than processions are usually followed. They return to the same street corner to see if the procession will pass again. The behavior the account describes is the behavior of people who have encountered something that their world does not have a category for, and who are responding to the absence of category with the specific and human combination of fascination and uncertainty, and the particular quality of sustained attention that extraordinary things generate in people who are not sure whether what they are feeling is closer to wonder or to something else. Yasuke moves through this with the bearing the accounts consistently describe, which is the bearing of a person who is inside the extraordinary quality of his own situation, and is meeting it from the inside rather than from the outside, who is not observing himself being observed, but simply present, simply here, simply walking through the streets of a city that has never seen anyone like him, in the direct attendance of the most powerful man in Japan, with the specific and unremarked quality of a person who has found, or arrived at, or simply settled into, the specific and grounded quality of being entirely where he is. The warriors of Nobunaga's inner circle develop, over the months and years of Yasuke's presence among them, a relationship with him that the accounts describe in terms that suggest something more complex and more interesting than the simple hierarchy of a foreign novelty accommodated within a Japanese military structure. The initial response of the warriors to his presence has the quality that initial responses to category-disrupting things always have, which is the quality of assessment, of the specific and practical calculation that warriors in a hierarchical and competitive environment perform when a new element enters the environment, and the implications of the new element for the existing hierarchy must be determined. He is large. This is the first and most immediately relevant fact for the warriors, the fact that registers before the questions of origin and status, and the specific and complicated relationship to the Lord that the sword and the room and the naming have established. Because the warriors of this period are organized around the assessment of physical threat and physical capability, with the specific and professional quality of people for whom this assessment is not a social activity, but a survival skill. And the assessment of Yasuke's physical capability produces in the warriors the specific and honest response of people who have assessed a genuine and substantial physical presence, and arrived at an accurate conclusion about what that presence represents. He is stronger than most of them. The accounts that describe Yasuke in physical terms describe a man whose size and strength are notable by the standards of the warriors he is among, not merely the dramatic contrast with the general population that his presence produces in the streets of Kyoto, but a genuine physical distinction even within the specific and physically developed population of the Lord's inner military circle. This distinction is not something that the warrior culture of this period treats as a neutral fact, because the warrior culture of this period is not organized around the treatment of physical capability as a neutral fact, but around the specific and serious engagement with physical capability as the most basic and most legible currency of the world they inhabit. He is taken seriously. This is the phrase that best describes what the accounts suggest about the quality of the relationship that develops between Yasuke and the warriors of Nobunaga's inner circle over the months and years of their proximity. The specific quality of engagement that serious people bring to other serious people when the seriousness of the other person has been established through the only means that the warrior culture accepts as establishing it, which is direct and unambiguous evidence of capability. He is not serious in the way that the tradition requires seriousness to be demonstrated, does not have the lineage and the school and the specific and accumulated formal training that the tradition uses as the primary evidence of a person's seriousness. But the tradition, in Nobunaga's court, more than in any other court in Japan in this period, is held lightly enough that the primary evidence can be supplemented by the secondary evidence of direct observation. And the direct observation of Yasuke produces in the warriors who observe him the specific and honest assessment that direct observation of genuine capability always produces in people who know what they are looking at. There are accounts of him demonstrating feats of strength that the warriors find impressive in the specific and professional way that warriors find demonstrations of physical capability impressive, which is to say, not with the general admiration of the public watching a spectacle, but with the specific and calibrated appreciation of people who understand exactly what the demonstration requires, and therefore understand exactly what the demonstration reveals. There are accounts of him participating in the physical activities that form the texture of a warrior's daily life in the Lord's service. The training and the practice and the various physical engagements that the life requires, and participating with the quality of presence and capability that produces in the people around him the specific and important quality of being regarded as one of them rather than as an addition to them. The circle of power has a new element, and the element has been accepted into the circle in the only way that the circle accepts new elements, which is by being genuine. Fear is not the same as respect, and respect is not the same as acceptance, and acceptance is not the same as belonging. And the distinctions between these things matter for understanding what Yasuke's position in the circle of power actually was, and what the quality of his life within that position actually felt like, or would have felt like, if the accounts gave us access to the feeling, rather than simply to the facts that the feeling surrounded. The people of Kyoto who press against the walls of the streets to see the procession pass are experiencing something that contains all four of these things, in a mixture that the accounts cannot always clearly distinguish, and that probably the people themselves could not have clearly distinguished if they had tried. Because fear and respect and acceptance and belonging are not always separable in the experience of encountering something genuinely extraordinary, are not always experienced as distinct emotional states, but as a single and complex quality of response that the vocabulary available to the person having the response can only approximately describe. The fear is real. The accounts that describe the response to Yasuke's presence in the streets of Kyoto do not use the word fear directly, but describe behaviors that fear produces. The pressing away and the silence, and the specific quality of stillness that a crowd achieves when the thing it is watching has moved past the threshold of the merely remarkable into the vicinity of the genuinely overwhelming. A man of Yasuke's physical presence moving through the streets of Kyoto in the immediate attendance of the most powerful lord in Japan is not simply a foreign curiosity, is not simply the exotic element of a sophisticated court's cosmopolitan display, is something that the people watching it cannot entirely account for in terms that make it comfortable, that presents to the watching mind a combination of physical scale and political proximity and sheer, unprecedented otherness that the watching mind does not have a framework for processing into something that can be held without some quality of the destabilizing. The respect is also real. The warriors of the inner circle are not afraid of Yasuke in the way that the people in the streets are affected by his presence, are not responding to the physical fact of him with the specific and involuntary quality of people encountering something their world has not prepared them for, because their world has prepared them for physical presence and physical capability in the specific and professional way that the warrior tradition prepares its practitioners. And the preparation means that what they respond to in Yasuke is not the overwhelming fact of him, but the assessed and calibrated reality of him, which is the reality of a person of genuine and substantial capability, who has been placed by the most powerful lord in Japan in a position that reflects the lord's own assessment of what that capability is worth. This produces respect. Not the uncomplicated respect of equals, not the specific and mutual quality of regard that develops between people who occupy equivalent positions within the same tradition, but the honest and practical respect that serious people extend to other serious people when the seriousness has been demonstrated rather than assumed, when the capability that the respect is responding to is real rather than conferred. And beneath both of these things, beneath the fear and the respect, and the various and complex qualities of response that his presence produces in the various and complex people who encounter it, there is something that the accounts only hint at, that they approach without fully naming, which is the specific and difficult quality of a world that is encountering something it has no category for, and is in the process of deciding what category to build. The category it eventually builds is not the category of the foreign visitor, not the category of the Jesuit companion, not the category of the exotic element of a sophisticated lord's cosmopolitan display. The category it builds is something closer to the category of the warrior, imperfect and incomplete, and not fully sanctioned by the tradition, and not fully legible to the people who are using it, but the closest available approximation to what the situation requires, to what the direct and ongoing evidence of his presence in the inner circle of the most powerful court in Japan is producing in the minds of the people who encounter him regularly enough to have moved past the first response into something more considered and more honest. He is beginning to be understood as what he is, whatever that is. The circle of power has a specific quality that is different from the quality of any other environment. A quality that the people inside it understand in the specific and embodied way that direct and long experience of something produces, and that the people outside it can only approximate through the observation and the description that the people inside it provide. The quality is something like this. The circle of power is the place where everything that happens in the country is known before it has finished happening, where the decisions that will determine the lives of millions of people are made by the specific and various people who are close enough to the man at the center to be present when the decisions are made, where the relationship between what is possible and what is actual is most compressed, where the distance between intention and execution is shortest, and the feedback between action and consequence is most immediate. Yasuke lives inside this quality. He is present for the decisions, or present in the vicinity of the decisions, close enough to the center that the decisions are made in the same rooms he occupies, and the same conversations he witnesses, even when he is not a participant in them. Present in the way that the people who are always near the powerful are present, which is a form of presence that is not exactly participation and not exactly observation, but something in between, something that shapes the person who experiences it in ways that are not always legible from the outside, but that accumulate over months and years into a specific and particular quality of understanding that only this kind of proximity to this kind of power produces. He sees Nobunaga whole, or as whole as any single person can see another person, with the specific and various knowledge that comes from observing someone across the full range of the situations that the life provides. not only in the formal and public situations where the Lord is performing the role of Lord, but in the less formal and less public situations where the role is maintained by habit and temperament rather than by conscious performance, where the person and the position are most completely fused and most honestly visible to the people who are close enough to see. What he sees is a man who is genuinely singular, genuinely unlike the other lords of his period, in the specific ways that matter for understanding why the period ended the way it did, and why it will not be resolved the way anyone who is not Nobunaga would have resolved it. He sees a man whose relationship to the possible is organized differently from most men's relationship to the possible, who operates in the space between what the tradition says can be done and what the situation actually requires, with a flexibility and a directness that produces outcomes the tradition could not have predicted, because the tradition was not the framework being used to produce them. And he sees a man who looked at him, at Yasuke, at a person from the other side of the world, with no lineage in the Japanese tradition, and no position in the Japanese hierarchy, and no category in the Japanese taxonomy of who belongs where and why, and decided that the looking was sufficient, that the direct and unmediated evidence of the encounter was more reliable than the tradition's prior conclusions about who could occupy what position and why. This is the specific and important thing that Nobunaga gave Yasuke beyond the name and the sword and the room and the proximity. He gave him the specific and rare quality of being seen rather than categorized, of being encountered as a person rather than as a problem to be solved, or a category to be filled, or a statement to be made about the Lord's sophistication and cosmopolitan range. He looked and he decided, and the deciding was organized around what the looking actually showed rather than what the available frameworks said the looking should show. Yasuke walks through the streets of Kyoto in the direct attendance of this man. The people press close to see him and fall back as the procession passes, and talk about what they saw in the specific and various ways that people talk about things they cannot fully account for. The ways that produce over time the rumors and the stories and the gradually solidifying legend of a presence so extraordinary that the city remembers it long after the presence is gone. He does not look back at them, or if he looks back, the accounts do not preserve it. And there is something in this, in the not looking back, or the not preserving of the looking back, that feels true to the person the accounts have been describing, the person who has been present for everything the life has given him, with the specific and grounded quality of someone who is always looking forward, always attending to what is here rather than what is watching. The procession moves through the streets of Kyoto. The city parts around it and closes behind it. And at its center, near the Lord, in the specific and unprecedented position that the Lord's decision has placed him in, a man from the other side of the world is walking through the middle of history with the bearing of a person who has accepted the extraordinary quality of his own situation so completely that the acceptance has become invisible, has become simply the condition of the life rather than a response to it. Shh. Just breathe. The streets are quiet now. The procession has passed, and the city has returned to its ordinary motion, and the specific and various quality of Kyoto in the early 1580s, the rebuilding and the commerce and the religious life and the specific and dense social texture of a city that has been the center of things for a very long time, and that continues to be the center of things, even as the nature of what it is the center of changes around it. Somewhere ahead on the road between the city and the castle, the circle of power is moving, and he is inside it. Good night. The night of the 21st day of the 6th month of the year 1582 begins the way most nights begin in Kyoto in the early summer, with the specific and unremarkable quality of an evening that has no particular reason to announce itself as different from the evenings that preceded it, that arrives with the same heat and the same sounds and the same gradual darkening of the sky over the mountains to the west that every summer evening in this city arrives with, that gives no indication to the people living through it that the morning they are moving toward will be a different kind of morning from the mornings they have been moving toward for their entire lives. Nobunaga is at Honnoji. The temple in the western part of the city is his accommodation for this visit to the capital, one of the places he uses when the business of the unification requires his presence in Kyoto rather than at Azuchi, a location chosen with the specific and practical quality of a man who selects his accommodations according to the requirements of the situation rather than the conventions of ceremony, who sleeps where the sleeping is strategically sensible rather than where the protocols of lordly accommodation suggest he should sleep. The temple is large enough and its grounds are defensible enough, and its location in the city is convenient enough that it has served this function before, has received Nobunaga and the reduced retinue that accompanies him on these visits, the smaller and more intimate circle of people who are present when the Lord is in the city without the full apparatus of the military force that accompanies him in the field. Yasuke is there. The accounts place him at Honnoji on this night, with the specific and matter-of-fact quality of a fact that requires no elaboration, because the elaboration is provided by everything that has been established about his position in the inner circle, by the months and years of proximity, and the sword, and the name, and the room near the Lord's quarters, by the pattern that the accounts have been accumulating since the naming that places him continuously and unremarkably in the immediate vicinity of Nobunaga, in exactly the kind of situation that this night begins as, which is to say, a night in the city, in the Lord's reduced and intimate retinue. Akechi Mitsuhide is also in the vicinity of Kyoto on this night. He is a lord of Nobunaga's service, or has been, a man of genuine ability and long association with the project of unification, a man whose relationship to Nobunaga has the specific and complicated quality of relationships between serious people who have been working in close proximity for a long time toward goals they share and through methods they do not always agree on. The relationship that is simultaneously too close for the comfortable distance of mere professional association and too various and too pressured to have produced the kind of trust that proximity over time ideally produces. He has an army with him, or the army is assembling in the darkness outside the city, and the army is moving toward Honnoji, and the movement is not the movement of a force that has been ordered to provide additional security for the Lord's accommodation, but the movement of a force that has been ordered to end the Lord's accommodation permanently. The reasons for Mitsuhide's decision to do what he is about to do are one of the enduring questions of Japanese historiography, one of the questions that the surviving record raises with great clarity and answers with great ambiguity, providing enough material for every proposed explanation, without providing enough material for any single explanation to achieve the kind of certainty that closes a question, rather than simply adding to the accumulation of plausible interpretations that surround it. The accounts suggest grievances, accumulated and various, the specific and corrosive quality of slights, real and perceived, building over years into something that the professional relationship can no longer contain. The accounts suggest calculation, the strategic assessment of a man who has observed the field of power carefully enough to identify the moment when the risk of action is lower than the risk of continued inaction. The accounts suggest both and neither, and things that are harder to name. What is not in question is what the army does when it reaches the temple. The attack begins before the temple is fully aware that it is an attack. This is the specific and tactical quality of what Mitsuhide has arranged, the quality of a military operation that has been designed to eliminate the gap between the moment of discovery and the moment of irreversibility, to move from concealment to conclusion, fast enough that the people inside the temple do not have the time between the two to organize a response that could change the outcome. The forces that come through the gates of Honnoji in the darkness of the early morning hours come with the specific and committed quality of people who know what they have come to do and have been organized around the doing of it, with a completeness that leaves no room for the hesitation or the reconsideration that the presence of doubt would produce. The temple grounds receive them with the specific quality of a space that is unprepared for what is entering it, that is organized around the expectations of a night that has given no indication of being different from other nights. And the gap between the organization of the space and the reality of what is entering it is the gap that the attack is designed to exploit, and that it does exploit with the specific and brutal efficiency of a military operation that has been planned by a serious commander who understands the terrain and the target, and the specific and narrow window of time in which the operation must be completed to produce the outcome it is designed to produce. Nobunaga is awake, or becomes awake, in the specific and immediate way that serious men become awake when the sounds around them change in the direction of the sounds of violence. When the quality of the night shifts from the ordinary, ambient texture of a city at rest to the specific and unmistakable quality of organized force moving with intent. The accounts that describe his response in the first minutes of the attack describe a man who is not in the condition of the person for whom the attack is a surprise, in the way that a surprise is paralyzing. Not frozen by the gap between expectation and reality, but in the condition of a person who has spent his entire adult life in a world where this kind of gap can open at any moment, and who has organized his relationship to that world accordingly, who meets the gap not with the paralysis of disbelief, but with the specific and immediate quality of assessment and response that decades of operating in violent and unpredictable conditions produce in the people who survive them. He fights. The accounts preserve this detail with the care that significant details receive from writers who understand what is significant. And the detail is significant in the way that actions are significant when they reveal something essential about the person performing them. When they show us, in the compressed and unmediated clarity of a crisis, what the person is made of at the level below the social performance of what they present themselves to be. Nobunaga fights with a bow, and then with a spear, and then, the accounts suggest, with the specific and accepted quality of a man who has assessed the situation with the ruthless accuracy that the situation requires, and has arrived at a conclusion that the situation imposes rather than that he chooses, which is the conclusion that the defense of the temple cannot succeed, and that the manner of what comes next is the only thing still available to his decision. Yasuke is in the temple. He is present for this in the specific and immediate quality of a person who is inside the event rather than outside it, who is not receiving the information of the attack through the mediated channels of report and description, but through the direct and sensory channels of being present when the gates give way and the fires begin, and the sound of the fighting fills the space that the night had been filling a few minutes before with the ordinary ambient texture of a summer city at rest. What Yasuke does in the minutes and hours of the attack on Honnoji is one of the questions that the historical record raises and then declines to answer with the specificity that the question seems to deserve, that provides enough fragments of information to make the outline of the answer visible, without providing enough to make the answer itself clear. He fights. This much the accounts suggest, in the specific and indirect way that the accounts suggest things they are not stating directly, through the texture of what is described, and the specific quality of attention that the descriptions bring to certain elements of the scene and not others. The Jesuit accounts that are the primary source for most of what we know about Yasuke's actions on this night describe a man who is present in the fighting rather than absent from it, who is in the vicinity of the violence rather than removed from it, who is engaged with the reality of the attack in the specific and direct quality of a person who is responding to it rather than observing it. The fighting at Honnoji is the fighting of a force that has already won against a defense that knows it cannot succeed, but that is organized around the specific and honored tradition of the defense that does not succeed but is made anyway. The defense that is not organized around the hope of victory, but around the quality of what the defense itself represents. The specific and important quality of the loyalty and the courage and the commitment to the Lord that the defense expresses, regardless of its outcome. The people who fight for Nobunaga in the temple on this night are not fighting because they believe they can win, are fighting because the fighting is the honest expression of what their relationship to the Lord requires of them in exactly this kind of moment. The moment when the relationship is tested most completely and most honestly by the specific and unambiguous demand of a situation that allows for no comfortable middle ground between the full expression of the loyalty and its abandonment. Yasuke fights with this quality, or the accounts suggest he fights with this quality, in the specific and fragmentary way that the accounts suggest things about a person whose inner life they do not have access to, but whose actions they preserve well enough to allow the inference of the quality that the actions express. He is not fighting for the tradition, is not fighting from within the specific and accumulated weight of a loyalty organized around lineage and obligation and the particular moral framework of the samurai relationship between lord and retainer. He is fighting from something else, from whatever the relationship between himself and Nobunaga has produced in him across the months and years of proximity and naming and the sword and the room near the Lord's quarters. From whatever quality of connection the specific and unprecedented situation of his life in Nobunaga's service has built between the man from the other side of the world and the Lord who looked at him and decided that the looking was sufficient. The fire begins. The fires of Honnoji are one of the things about the night that the accounts agree on most completely. The specific and consuming quality of the burning that transforms the temple from a space into an event, that removes from the defense the specific and practical dimension of having a defensible space to defend, and replaces it with the specific and clarifying quality of an ending that is happening regardless of anything the defense can do to prevent it. The fires are set deliberately, the accounts suggest, set by the defenders in the specific and understood tradition of the final defense that denies the attacker the specific quality of victory that capturing the Lord alive would represent, that converts the defeat into the form of defeat that the tradition regards as the most honest available. Nobunaga makes his decision in the fire, and Yasuke is there when he makes it. The specific and consequential question of what Nobunaga said to Yasuke in the last minutes inside the burning temple is a question that the record preserves in one form, and that the subsequent centuries of telling and retelling have preserved in multiple and not always consistent forms. The kind of question whose answer matters enough to the people telling the story that the answer gets shaped, over time, by the requirements of what the story needs, rather than exclusively by the evidence of what happened. What the accounts suggest, in their most stripped and careful form, is this. Nobunaga, in the final minutes inside the temple, gave Yasuke a sword. Not the sword that Yasuke already carried, not the sword that had been given months or years before, as the statement of position and trust that sword-giving in this context represented, but a sword that was Nobunaga's own, the specific and significant transfer of a personal weapon from the man who is about to die to the man he is giving it to, a transfer that carries within it a weight of meaning that the tradition knows how to read, even when the circumstances of the transfer are as far outside the tradition's categories as these circumstances are. He told him to go. This is the account that the sources provide, or the account that the sources approach without fully stating. The instruction to leave the burning temple and take the sword to Nobunaga's son, the specific and practical final act of a man who has assessed the situation with the same ruthless accuracy that he brought to the beginning of the defense, and arrived at the only remaining decision that is genuinely his to make, which is not the decision about the outcome of the night, which has already been made by Mitsuhide and his army, but the decision about the form that the ending takes, and the specific and limited things that the ending can still accomplish. Yasuke leaves the temple. He moves through the burning and the fighting with the specific quality of a man who has been given a direction and is moving in it, through the fire and the chaos of the final minutes of the defense, with the bearing that the accounts consistently describe as his bearing, the grounded and unremarked quality of a person who is inside an extraordinary situation and is meeting it from the inside, who is not performing his response to it, but simply responding, moving toward the door with the sword and the instruction and the specific and heavy quality of a person who has just received the last thing a person they were close to will ever give them. He is captured outside. The forces of Mitsuhide's army that are surrounding the temple grounds receive him with the specific quality of people who are encountering something that disrupts their expectations in the moment when disrupted expectations are most costly, when the operation is in its final and most sensitive phase, and the appearance of something outside the anticipated categories requires an immediate decision about how to categorize it and what the categorization requires. They have never seen anyone like him. This is the fact that the capture returns to, the specific and foundational fact that has been the organizing condition of Yasuke's entire life in Japan, and that is now, in the most consequential moment of that life, the fact that determines what happens next. Akechi Mitsuhide looks at Yasuke and makes a decision that the historians have been analyzing for 4 centuries, and that the analysis has not entirely resolved. Because the decision is the kind of decision that sits at the intersection of multiple possible explanations without being fully accounted for by any single one of them. He does not kill him. This is the fact, the specific and consequential fact that separates the night at Honnoji from the ending that the logic of the situation seems to require, that introduces into the story a gap between the expected outcome and the actual outcome that the story has been returning to ever since, trying to understand what the gap means and what it reveals about the man who created it and the man whose life it preserved. The decision to spare Yasuke is recorded in the Jesuit accounts with the specific quality of a detail that the writers found significant enough to preserve, but not significant enough to fully explain. The kind of detail that primary sources often contain. The kind that later readers find more interesting than the people who recorded it apparently found it. Because later readers have access to the shape of the whole story and can see in the detail a weight that the people recording it, who were inside the moment rather than outside it, could not fully perceive. Mitsuhide's reported reasoning, as the Jesuit accounts reconstruct it, is this: Yasuke is an animal. The word the accounts use, or the word that the accounts report that Mitsuhide used, is the word that the Japanese of this period applied to people and things outside the human categories of the tradition. The word that is not quite the word for beast, and not quite the word for barbarian, but something that partakes of both. The specific and dismissive category that a person reaches for when they want to place something outside the moral and social framework that would otherwise require them to treat it in a specific way. He is not Japanese. He therefore does not fall within the framework of obligation and loyalty and the specific and serious moral weight of the samurai relationship that would make his actions on this night, his fighting for Nobunaga in the burning temple, a matter of the specific and consequential significance that the actions of a Japanese warrior in the same situation would carry. He is, in Mitsuhide's framing, simply an object that was in the possession of the Lord, an exotic element of a sophisticated court's cosmopolitan display, something that cannot be guilty of loyalty because it cannot be the kind of thing that loyalty belongs to. This reasoning is convenient. This is the thing about it that the historians return to, the specific and interesting quality of a reasoning that produces exactly the conclusion that the reasoning's author needs it to produce, that arrives at the outcome of not killing a person through the mechanism of deciding that the person is not the kind of thing that the decision to kill would apply to. The convenience of the reasoning does not make it false, does not mean that Mitsuhide did not believe it, or that the cultural framework he was drawing on did not exist, or that the conclusion he arrived at was not, within his own framework, genuine. But the convenience is worth noting, because convenient reasoning is the kind of reasoning that tells you something about what the person reasoning needed to conclude before they reasoned their way to the conclusion. He sends Yasuke to the Jesuit residence. The transfer is the specific and practical form that the decision takes. The conversion of the abstract determination about what Yasuke is and is not into the concrete and immediate action of putting him somewhere that is neither the battlefield nor the captivity that the battlefield's logic would otherwise require. The Jesuit residence in Kyoto is the place that Mitsuhide's framing of the situation makes available, the place where the foreign and the outside the tradition naturally belong according to the categories that the framing requires, the place where the thing that is not Japanese and therefore not the kind of thing that the knight's decisions apply to can be deposited, and the depositing can serve as the conclusion of the matter. Yasuke walks to the Jesuit residence through the streets of a city that is in the process of understanding what happened in the temple, through the specific and vertiginous quality of a Kyoto that is the same city it was yesterday and completely different, that has woken to a morning that contains a different organization of power than the morning that the previous night appeared to be moving toward, that is in the process of receiving the information that the most powerful man in Japan is dead, and that the world is reorganizing itself around the absence. He walks through this with the bearing the accounts describe. The sword that Nobunaga gave him in the final minutes of the temple is with him, or is no longer with him. The accounts diverging on this detail, with the specific quality of accounts that preserve the outline of an event without preserving all of the details that the outline requires. And the divergence is itself honest, is the honest record of the limits of what the people who were present and the people who received the information from the people who were present could hold and transmit with accuracy across the noise and the chaos of a night that changed everything. The temple is still burning behind him. The smoke rises over Kyoto in the early morning, with the specific and terrible quality of smoke from a fire that is not an accident, that is the visible evidence of a decision and its consequences, that marks against the sky of a summer morning the specific and permanent fact of what has ended and what has not yet begun. He does not look back, or, if he looks back, the accounts do not preserve it. And there is something in this, in the not looking back, or the not preserving of the looking back, that is the most honest thing the record has said about him since the ship came into Sakai Harbor. The specific and unelaborated fact of a person moving forward through a world that has just changed completely, carrying what they were given, going where they were sent, present for the ending in the only way that presence for something this large is possible, which is simply by being there, completely and honestly there, all the way to the last. Shh. Just breathe. The city is quiet now. The fires have found what they came for and are finishing their work in the specific and unhurried way that fires finish their work, consuming what remains with the patient and indifferent quality of something that has no opinion about what it is consuming. Somewhere in the streets between the temple and the Jesuit residence, a man is walking through the smoke of the world he lived in, carrying the last thing he was given, moving forward, because forward is the only direction left. Good night.